right, I'm going to try and use the podium mic. You guys can all hear me okay? Yeah. All right, great. So thanks to the Atlantic for having us. Very exciting to be here. I think if you had asked somebody, 6 or 7 years ago when Uber got started, if we would be here talking about infrastructure, it would have seemed a little far-fetched, right? I think the core objective when we got started was just to get a ride reliably at the push of a button, right? That was the entire goal. That was the problem they set out to solve. They started in San Francisco, but it's grown since then. And so I think as we've started to grow, we've started to collaborate more with groups like transit agencies, with traditional transportation operators, departments of transportation, to think through the transportation infrastructure challenges that are long-standing and not new. But how do we think through Uber as a potential tool to think differently about them and potentially more efficiently? And so I think one of the places this really started to take off was the idea that we could fit more people into fewer cars. And so the first way, let's see if this works. Grand test. Oh, maybe not. Hey, there we go. So the first way this started to happen was, once we got past the core service and started to see this enormous number of rides that were overlapping with each other, it became clear that if we could build a product to make that an option for people to share a ride, that they might actually participate in something like that. So we launched Uber Pool in 2014. This is the basic premise. You used to have 2 trips, you combine them together in real time, and you get carpooling dynamically without having to plan in advance. And so this is something that's obviously been a public policy objective at the federal level in the US for a very long time. In 1980, 20% of commutes were done by carpooling. By 2010, that number had dropped down below 10%. So obviously getting more people into fewer cars is compelling, but it's hard. And so I think we've been able to provide with Uber Pool, which is now in more than 30 cities around the world, not just places in the US, but places like London, Mexico City, and Jakarta. And we're seeing uptake of this product everywhere we operate. And so it's compelling at the individual level because you can save time and make something more efficient. But as you start to get out, let's see which button worked. I'll try and. Any tips? Yeah, there we go, okay. So we start to get out to a bigger level, right? You start to see that this is an animation of, on the left, what happened when you had individual UberX rides. On the right, you start to bring down the amount of vehicles that are necessary to move the same quantity of people by getting multiple people in one car. And so that's a nice graphic. It's meaningful for us. We can start to make our vehicles more efficient, deliver rides more cheaply. But if you extend it out to the infrastructure level, I think we've started to see interesting studies come out. This is not from us, but someone did this for Toronto, and they added up, if you could get the car occupancy average up from 1.08 to 1.2, which sounds small, but it's a meaningful change. If you can do that, you could, in theory, save $9 billion in road infrastructure, right? Just by virtue of having less lane miles required. If you think about a highway, if you look at the average car, there's basically one person in every car. And so if you can start to change that dynamic and focus on incentives to get people sharing a ride, obviously you can start to save enormous amounts of money in expanding infrastructure. And that's clearly a need here, right? There's a big push in the US, I think, to repair the infrastructure we have. And so I think the more efficiently we can use what we already have, the more money we can spend more effectively. And so we're excited about the long term of trying to increase the number of people in the average car and what that will do for infrastructure spending. I thought I had it. There we go. I went too far. And that's just while they're moving, right? I think the obvious other play is that there's an enormous amount of space, as we all know, by cars, that it's occupied by cars when they're not moving. Cars are idle for the vast majority of their life. I always like this stat because nobody actually knows how many parking spaces there are in the US. Some people say it's like 200 million. Some people say it's as many as 2 billion. There's a lot of estimates that vary. But if you conservatively assume that a parking space costs $10,000, some of them cost much more. If you're in a city, it's in a structured parking lot, it might cost $30,000. But if you assume there's about 1 trillion spaces and they each cost $10,000, right, that's just an enormous amount of money that's locked up right now in parking infrastructure. And there's plenty of research to show that parking infrastructure actually encourages more driving. So not only are we putting an enormous amount of money into the infrastructure to park our cars that are primarily not being used, they're not in motion most of their life, we're also encouraging more driving and more wasteful use of infrastructure just by providing that parking. So, we started to partner to think through some of those problems, but we're also working on the transit side, right? One of the other big sources of investment for infrastructure in the US, the transportation side, is public transportation. So there's a couple partnerships that are highlighted here. We're doing more of these over time. I'll talk about the one on the left, which is in Summit, New Jersey, where we have a city that has come to us to think through how they can provide access to rail infrastructure, right? There's an excellent rail service into Manhattan, as long as Penn Station is working the way it should. It works beautifully, but it's really hard to get to and from the station. And so there's a very large park and ride lot in the middle of Summit that was basically full. They were thinking through spending millions of dollars to expand that parking lot. There's a lot of reasons you might not want to do that. Cost is one, the impact on the urban environment is another one. And so they've been working with us to provide a discount for rides to and from the train station within the town of Summit, to make it easier. And so the goal there is if you can make the combination of Uber and transit together more compelling, more convenient than driving your own car, you can start to have a win-win situation. And we've seen a lot of that, where we've seen surveys from the American Public Transport Association that came out last year that suggested that people who take Uber more than average also take transit more than average. So we see a lot of overlap in terms of working together to actually increase the effectiveness of transit over the long haul. And the other place we're starting to work together is on data. So as our cars move around the city, see how seamlessly I can do this. As our cars are moving around cities around the world, they're generating a lot of information that we're using for a lot of internal purposes, right? We're building tools like Uber Pool that rely on knowing the real-time location of riders and drivers. A lot of products are coming out of that. But we're also creating a lot of data exhaust that's not necessarily directly useful for our applications, right? And so what we're trying to think through is how can we find public applications for some of that information? And so we've been thinking through this problem for a long time. I've been in this role for about a year and a half, and since early 2016, we've been trying to think through what are some places that we can productively have a conversation around how we share data in the public interest. And, a couple of the constraints we have to work through, which you probably heard about before, are how do you preserve, individual rider and driver privacy when they choose to use your service? How do you think about the competitive landscape that a company like Uber operates in, but still get to a place where you can deliver really meaningful impact through data sharing for cities and governments around the world? And so our first step in that process was Uber Movement, which we launched at the beginning of this year. It's live today. If you go to movement.uber.com, you can check it out. This is a screenshot for Washington, D.C. And what it's showing is a snapshot of travel times within the metro area. And we're showing that keyed into zones that are already defined by public agencies, whether it's census tracts or traffic analysis zones that are used by infrastructure planners. And the reason we started with that audience, we started with the MPO audience. These are the people in every region in the country who decide how federal transportation dollars are actually spent. But a lot of the challenges these people have, and you can imagine predicting the future, as we just heard about, is very difficult. But it's particularly difficult if you don't have good data on existing conditions right now. Right? And you'd think it'd be easy to acquire very good fine-grained data on travel speeds in your city, but it's actually not. Right? Many MPOs are spending a lot of money or don't have updated versions of this or can't get it at repeated intervals to kind of check how things are changing. And so that's what this does today. It's freely available. The plan is to make it widely available. It's currently in 4 cities, Washington, D.C., Boston, Manila, and Sydney, Australia. You can download the data, you can plug it into other data sets. We're not trying to make this exclusive. We want to be able to plug into tools that are already being used. And so we think about movement and the work we're doing around travel times as just a first step. And there's a lot of other locations where we can provide information from the fact that we're operating in cities that's of great value to the people who manage the major infrastructure in our cities and states and across the country. Because we are not an infrastructure provider or a maintainer, but we obviously use that infrastructure and have a long-term interest in making sure that things are running effectively. And so this is a great place for collaboration we're excited about. And I'll end, if I can, just by talking about the car you saw out front, right? I think there's a lot of talk around autonomous vehicles. You can't turn around in a transportation conversation and not hear about it. I think that it's important to highlight, an important distinction, right? The car is one thing, the car is pretty, we have one outside, we're excited about it. But I think one of the most important things about autonomous vehicles is how they actually get deployed into cities. And there's at least a couple ways that might happen. Right? And the most obvious, I think, path of least resistance is that everyone who currently owns a car today, which is the vast majority of Americans, replaces that car with a self-driving car. And so now we have a system of privately owned cars that are self-driving. I think if we do that, if that's the path we go, there's an enormous missed opportunity. Right? I think for all the changes we want to make around shared cars, around reformatting infrastructure, around getting rid of parking, using our space in cities more effectively, freeing up road space for cycle lanes and other things that were just talked about, I think what we want to be emphasizing is a shared model. And that's why I think working at Uber is a unique place to be talking about autonomous vehicles, because I started this presentation with Uber Pool, and that's actually where we started. Right? We started focusing on a shared rides product in 2014, and we started talking about autonomous vehicles after that. And to me, that's actually the order of priority. Right? We should be getting people into the idea of not having to tow their own car around with them, and even being open to the idea of sitting in the backseat with a stranger, and then use autonomous to make that experience easier and more compelling over time. I think if we go the other route and just replace the system we have today with a system of personally owned autonomous vehicles, we miss out an enormous opportunity for the change we're all trying to push. So that's what I think is interesting. I think that companies that are focused on the shared model, I think, have a potential for enormous benefit for cities. And so that's why we want to collaborate and work with the people in this room, and the people in Washington and elsewhere, to kind of help make those visions that have been out there for cities for a long time come true, and using shared autonomous vehicles as a pathway for that. So thanks.